My name is Jonathan Reed. I'm 29 years old, originally from a small town in Wisconsin, but I've spent the last few years traveling for work as a freelance photographer. My job often takes me to remote locations, and I've always loved the solitude of the open road. At least, I did, until that night. It was late October, and I had just finished a photo shoot for a client in Montana. The journey back home was a long one, but I wasn't in any rush. I preferred driving through the night, with the empty roads and the glow of my headlights illuminating the darkness. There was something comforting about the quiet, the feeling of being completely alone. Or so I thought. The first few hours of the drive were uneventful. I had my playlist on shuffle, a thermos of coffee in the cup holder, and miles of open highway ahead of me. Around midnight, I decided to take a shortcut, a back road I'd found on my GPS that promised to shave an hour off my trip. It was a narrow, winding path, cutting through a dense forest. There were no streetlights, and the trees seemed to press in on either side of the car, their skeletal branches scratching at the sky. At first, the road was peaceful, almost serene, but as I drove deeper into the forest, an uneasy feeling crept over me. The music on my playlist began to feel intrusive, so I turned it off. The silence that followed was oppressive, broken only by the hum of my engine and the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. I told myself I was just tired, that I'd been driving too long, but the feeling wouldn't go away. Then I saw them. At first, it was just a faint glow in the distance, a cluster of flickering lights up ahead. I slowed down, my headlights revealing a group of figures standing in the middle of the road. They were dressed in white robes, their faces obscured by hoods, and they held torches that cast eerie shadows across the forest. There were at least a dozen of them, maybe more, standing in a loose circle. I stopped the car, unsure of what to do. My heart was pounding, and I felt an almost primal urge to turn around and get out of there. But the road was too narrow to make a quick U-turn, and the trees were too thick to pull off to the side. I considered honking my horn, hoping they'd move, but something about the way they were standing, so still, so deliberate, made me hesitate. As I sat there, frozen, one of them stepped forward. It was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, his hood casting a shadow over his face. He raised his arm, pointing directly at my car. The others turned in unison, their movements unnervingly synchronized, and I realized they were all looking at me. Panic surged through me, and I shifted into reverse, ready to back away. But before I could move, they began to walk toward me, their torches bobbing in the darkness. I glanced in my rearview mirror, and my stomach dropped. There were more of them behind me, blocking the road. I hadn't even noticed them approach. Trapped, I rolled down my window just enough to shout, "What do you want?" My voice sounded small, swallowed by the night. They didn't answer. They didn't even slow down. They just kept coming, their footsteps crunching on the gravel, their faces hidden beneath their hoods. When they were only a few feet away, the tall man raised his torch and spoke in a deep, guttural voice. I couldn't understand the words. It wasn't English or any language I recognized. It sounded ancient, otherworldly, and it sent a chill down my spine. Then they stopped, forming a tight circle around my car. The tall man stepped closer, so close I could see his hands, pale and scarred, gripping the torch. His hood tilted upward, and for a moment, I thought I saw his face. A grotesque mask of jagged scars and empty eye sockets. But then the torchlight flickered, and the image was gone. Without thinking, I slammed my foot on the gas. The car lurched forward, scattering the figures in front of me. I heard the dull thud of bodies hitting the hood, the shouts of the robed figures, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. The road was narrow, and the trees whipped past in a blur as I sped away, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly they ached. After what felt like an eternity, the road straightened, and the forest began to thin. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest gas station, a small, dimly lit building at the edge of the highway. My hands were shaking as I stepped out of the car, my mind racing with what I'd just seen. I tried to explain it to the clerk inside, but he just stared at me like I was crazy. "There's no road like that around here," he said. "Not anymore. They closed it off years ago. Too many accidents." I didn't argue. I just nodded, bought a bottle of water, and got back in my car. I drove straight home, my eyes darting to the rearview mirror every few minutes, half expecting to see the robed figures chasing after me. But the road was empty, and I eventually made it back in one piece. For weeks, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd been marked somehow, that the cult, or whatever they were, would find me again. I stopped taking back roads. I stopped driving at night. But no matter how much I tried to move on, the memory of that night stayed with me. And sometimes, late at night, I still hear it, that guttural voice, chanting in a language I'll never understand, echoing in the back of my mind. My name is Alex Turner. I'm 34 years old, a systems engineer from Des Moines, Iowa. My job is solitary by nature. I spend most of my days working from home, surrounded by screens, cables, and the hum of machines. I've always been drawn to quiet hobbies, reading, tinkering with old electronics, and scavenging thrift shops for forgotten treasures. I thought that's all the radio was when I found it, a piece of forgotten history, but I was wrong. It was a Saturday afternoon, one of those gray, drizzly days where staying indoors felt more like an invitation than a choice. I decided to check out a garage sale down the street. Among the usual clutter, dusty books, chipped plates, and worn-out furniture, there was a radio. It was bulky, with a wooden casing that had been lovingly polished at some point in its past. Its dials were large and smooth, encased in tarnished brass. Something about it drew me in. I paid $5 for it and carried it home, feeling like I'd unearthed a hidden gem. Once I got back, I set it on my workbench. It smelled faintly of wood polish and old paper. The power cord looked intact, so I plugged it in. The light behind the dial flickered on, casting a soft orange glow, and static hissed from the speakers. For a moment, it was just that white noise, the sound of emptiness. But then I heard it, a voice, faint but unmistakable, buried deep within the static. I leaned closer, twisting the tuning dial slowly, trying to find the source. The voice grew clearer, though it was still fragmented, like it was fighting to break through a wall of interference. Alex. I froze. It had said my name. I told myself it was a coincidence, that I must have misheard. I kept turning the dial, searching for a station. Occasionally, snippets of music or other voices would filter through, but none of it lasted. Then the voice returned, louder this time, cutting through the static like a knife. Alex, do you hear me? It wasn't a coincidence. The voice was male, deep and calm, with an odd mechanical undertone. It sounded close, yet distant at the same time, like someone speaking through a tunnel. My heart raced. I turned the dial again, desperate to escape the voice, but it followed me no matter where I tuned. Each time it spoke, it grew more specific. It mentioned my job, my favorite coffee shop, even the fact that I had a scar on my left hand from a childhood accident. Things no one could have known. I unplugged the radio. The static died instantly, and silence filled the room. I laughed nervously, trying to shake the unease that had settled over me. It was just a broken machine, I thought. A fluke. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined the voice, replaying its words in my mind. It wasn't just what it said, but how it said it, calm, deliberate, as though it had been waiting for me. The next morning, I decided to test the radio again. Curiosity, or maybe defiance, drove me. I plugged it in, and the static returned immediately. For a long time, there was nothing but the faint hiss of white noise. I almost felt relieved, but then it spoke again. This time, it didn't just talk about my past. It began describing my present. It told me I was wearing a blue sweater, that my coffee mug was sitting half empty on the table. It knew I hadn't slept. I felt like I was being watched, though I was alone in my apartment. The windows were closed, the curtains drawn, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was observing me from somewhere beyond my understanding. The voice started predicting things. At first, they were small and harmless. The delivery man would arrive with my package in 3 minutes. The phone would ring twice before a spam caller hung up. It was eerily accurate, but I couldn't explain it. Then the predictions became darker. The voice told me a storm was coming, that it would knock out the power in my building. Hours later, the storm arrived, violent and sudden. Lightning flashed outside, and the lights in my apartment flickered before going out completely. Sitting in the darkness, illuminated only by the orange glow of the radio's dial, I listened as the voice described the storm in perfect detail. It knew where the lightning would strike, which streets would flood. It was as though the radio was tuned into something far beyond the frequencies of this world. And then it said something that chilled me to my core. "Alex, you need to leave. They're coming." I didn't know who they were, but the tone in the voice was different this time. Urgent, almost panicked. It repeated the warning, louder, cutting through the static like a scream. I looked out the window, but the street was empty. I tried to dismiss it as paranoia, but deep down, I knew I couldn't ignore it. I grabbed my keys and my coat and left the apartment, my heart pounding in my chest. As I drove aimlessly through the rain-soaked streets, the voice echoed in my mind. I hadn't taken the radio with me, but I could still hear it, as though it had burrowed into my consciousness. I didn't know where to go or what I was running from. All I knew was that the voice had been right about everything else. For days, I stayed in a motel on the outskirts of town, afraid to go back. When I finally returned, my apartment felt different, colder, emptier, like something vital had been drained from it. The radio was still there, sitting on my workbench, but I couldn't bring myself to touch it. I should have destroyed it. I should have thrown it away, smashed it, anything to sever the connection. But I didn't. Now, weeks later, the voice is still with me. It no longer needs the radio to reach me. It speaks to me in the quiet moments when I'm alone with my thoughts. It tells me things I don't want to hear, things I can't escape. And sometimes, late at night, it laughs. I don't know who or what it is, but I know this. Once it finds you, it never lets go. My name is Ethan Cross. I'm 42 years old, a graphic designer by trade, and a restless insomniac by nature. I've spent most of my adult life drifting between cities and towns, chasing fleeting moments of inspiration and trying to escape a sense of emptiness I can never quite shake. This story, though, isn't about my work or my struggles. It's about a single night that unraveled everything I thought I knew about reality. It began with a train ride. I was in the middle of a long stretch of freelance work, bouncing between small towns in the Midwest. I had just finished a project in Kansas City and decided to visit a distant cousin in Colorado. It wasn't planned. I rarely planned anything, but the thought of a change of scenery seemed appealing. I booked a ticket on a night train, hoping I could sleep during the journey and arrive feeling refreshed. The station was nearly empty when I arrived. Just a few tired travelers slumped on benches and a board attendant behind the counter. Outside, the platform was bathed in the sickly yellow glow of overhead lights, their hum blending with the occasional murmur of distant trains. The air was thick with the smell of rain on concrete, though the storm had passed hours earlier. When my train arrived, it was almost silent, gliding into the station like a phantom. Its cars were old but well-maintained, their polished surfaces reflecting the dim light. The conductor, an elderly man with a weathered face, barely glanced at me as I boarded. The inside of the train was dimly lit, with plush seats upholstered in a deep burgundy fabric. The few other passengers were scattered throughout the car, each absorbed in their own world. I chose a window seat near the middle, dropped my bag on the floor, and settled in. As the train began to move, the gentle rocking and rhythmic clatter of the wheels lulled me into a trance. The darkness outside the window was absolute, broken only occasionally by flashes of distant lightning. I leaned back, closed my eyes, and let the motion carry me toward sleep. I don't know how much time had passed when I first noticed something was wrong. It wasn't dramatic at first, just a vague sense of unease. The train was still moving, the wheels still clattering along the tracks, but there was something off about the sound. It felt too regular, like a looped recording rather than the natural variations of a real train ride. I opened my eyes and looked around. The car was empty. The other passengers were gone. Panic prickled at the edges of my mind. But I told myself there was a logical explanation. Maybe they had moved to another car, or maybe I'd fallen asleep and missed a stop. I stood up, grabbing my bag, and headed toward the door at the end of the car. The next car was the same. Plush burgundy seats, dim lighting, and no passengers. I kept moving, car after car, but each one was identical to the last. It was as if I were walking through a loop, a repeating corridor that stretched into infinity. I tried looking out the windows, hoping to see a station or at least some familiar landmarks, but the view outside was impossibly dark. No stars, no moon, no passing lights, just a void that seemed to swallow everything. By the time I reached the fifth or sixth car, my sense of time had begun to unravel. The train was still moving, but it felt like I wasn't getting anywhere. I stopped and sat down, trying to collect my thoughts. That's when I noticed the door. It was at the far end of the car, just past the last row of seats. Unlike the others, it wasn't labeled or lit by a small overhead lamp. It was black, with no handle or visible hinges, and it seemed to absorb the dim light around it. Something about the door terrified me. It felt wrong, like it didn't belong in the world I knew. I tried to ignore it, to convince myself it was just a storage closet or a maintenance hatch, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching me. Eventually, I stood up and approached the door, my heart pounding in my chest. As I got closer, I realized it wasn't just black, it was moving. The surface rippled like liquid, and faint shapes seemed to shift within it, just out of focus. I reached out, my fingers trembling, and the door opened on its own. Behind it was a staircase, spiraling downward into darkness. The steps were made of iron, slick with some oily substance that gleamed in the faint light. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to turn back, but something compelled me to descend. The air grew colder with each step, and the walls seemed to close in around me. I lost track of time again, but it felt like I'd been descending for hours before I reached the bottom. The staircase opened into a cavernous space, larger than the train itself could possibly contain. It was filled with rows of train cars, stacked on top of each other like a twisted version of a parking garage. Some were pristine, while others were rusted and decayed, their windows shattered and doors hanging open. As I walked through the maze of cars, I began to notice something horrifying. Each car seemed to hold fragments of different lives. One was filled with children's toys and drawings, scattered as if their owners had left in a hurry. Another was a dining car, its tables set with half-eaten meals that had long since rotted. There was a car filled with photographs, their images distorted and burned, and another where the seats were occupied by mannequins dressed in tattered clothing. It was a museum of forgotten moments, a graveyard of abandoned lives. In the center of the cavern was a single chair, illuminated by a spotlight that seemed to come from nowhere. On the chair sat a figure, its back turned to me. As I approached, I realized the figure wasn't human. It was made of the same black, rippling substance as the door, and its shape shifted constantly, cycling through different forms: a child, a man, a woman, an old crone. When it spoke, its voice was a chorus, layered and inhuman. It told me I was part of the train now, that I'd always been part of it. It showed me glimpses of my own life, moments I'd forgotten or suppressed. It revealed truths I didn't want to face. And then it sent me back. I woke up in my seat, the train still moving. The other passengers were back, staring out the windows or reading books, as if nothing had happened. But I knew it wasn't the same train. Not really. The landscape outside was still a void, and the sound of the wheels on the tracks was still too regular, too perfect. I'm still on the train. No matter how many stops it makes, no matter how many times I try to leave, I always find myself back in my seat. The other passengers are the same. Their faces blank and their movements mechanical. I don't know how long I've been here. Days? Weeks? Years? Time doesn't mean anything anymore. All I know is that the train never stops for long, and every so often, I see the black door again. This time, I don't think I'll come back. My name is Mark Harris. I'm 34 years old, and I've been a rideshare driver for almost 6 years. It's not the most glamorous job, but it's been good enough to pay the bills and give me a sense of independence. I live in a small town in Ohio, where the roads are mostly quiet, especially at night. That's why I usually work the late shifts. People who call for rides at odd hours tend to tip well, and I've always enjoyed the solitude of driving under the stars. But one night, about 3 months ago, everything changed. That night left me questioning not only my job but my sanity and my safety. I haven't told anyone about this until now. Not my family, not my friends. I don't think they believe me, but I need to get it out, even if it sounds crazy. Maybe sharing it will help me make sense of what happened. It was a Tuesday night. Actually, more like early Wednesday morning. The streets were dead quiet, as usual. I'd had a decent night, picking up a couple of late-night partygoers and a business traveler heading home from the airport. I was ready to call it quits when a new request popped up on the app. The pickup location wasn't far, just a few miles out on the edge of town. Normally, I wouldn't have taken a ride so late, but the app showed a surge price. The money was too good to pass up. The location was in an area I wasn't too familiar with. A stretch of road bordered by woods on one side and empty fields on the other. I'd driven through it before, but never at night. The darkness felt heavier there, like the trees were swallowing up the moonlight. As I approached the pickup spot, I noticed a figure standing on the side of the road. The man looked off. He was tall and thin, dressed in a dark coat that seemed too big for him. His face was pale, almost gray, and he stood unnaturally still, like a statue. I slowed down and rolled down the window. "You called for a ride?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He nodded without saying a word and opened the back door. His movements were stiff, almost robotic, as he climbed in and sat directly behind me. I felt a chill run down my spine the moment he closed the door. The air inside the car seemed to drop several degrees, and I could smell something faint but unpleasant, like wet earth or decaying leaves. "Where to?" I asked, glancing at him in the rearview mirror. His eyes met mine, and I immediately regretted looking. They were dark, sunken, and devoid of any emotion. He finally spoke, his voice low and raspy, like it hadn't been used in years. "Ridgefield Cemetery." The request took me aback. Ridgefield Cemetery was a good 20 minutes away, out in the middle of nowhere. It wasn't exactly a popular destination, especially not at this hour. But it wasn't my job to ask questions. I just nodded, punched the destination into the app, and started driving. The road ahead was a long, narrow stretch of asphalt with no streetlights. The only illumination came from my headlights cutting through the thick darkness. The silence in the car was suffocating. Most passengers would at least try to make small talk, but not this guy. He sat perfectly still in the back seat, and I could feel his eyes on me through the rearview mirror. Every time I glanced up, I found him staring, not at his phone, not out the window, but directly at me. His gaze was unblinking, and it made my skin crawl. To distract myself, I turned on the radio. Static. I flipped through the stations, but all I got was more static. Strange. I knew these roads could be spotty for reception, but it wasn't normal for every station to go out at once. I shut the radio off and focused on the drive, trying to ignore the unsettling feeling creeping over me. About 10 minutes into the ride, the man finally spoke again. "Do you drive this way often?" he asked. His voice was flat, almost mechanical, but there was something beneath it, something that made my stomach tighten. "Not really," I said, trying to keep my tone casual. "Most people stick to the city. You're the first passenger I've picked up around here this late." He didn't respond. The silence stretched on, heavier this time. I glanced in the mirror again, and my breath caught. He was smiling. Not a friendly smile, but something wrong. His lips were pulled back too far, exposing teeth that looked unnaturally sharp. It was like a predator baring its fangs. I gripped the steering wheel tighter and kept my eyes on the road. The miles dragged by. The closer we got to Ridgefield Cemetery, the more I felt like something was pressing down on me. The air in the car had grown colder, and my hands were starting to tremble. I tried to shake it off, convincing myself it was just my imagination. But then the headlights flickered. For a split second, the road ahead went dark. When the lights came back on, I saw something in the distance. A figure, standing in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, my heart pounding in my chest. The car skidded to a stop, and I squinted through the windshield, trying to make out what I'd just seen. But there was nothing there. The road was empty. "Keep going," the man said from the back seat. His voice was sharper now, almost a growl. I hesitated, my hands frozen on the wheel. "Drive," he commanded, and this time there was no mistaking the menace in his tone. I swallowed hard and pressed the gas pedal. The car lurched forward, and I tried to steady my breathing. Maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe it was just a trick of the shadows. But deep down, I knew better. As I drove on, the tension in the car became unbearable. The road seemed to stretch endlessly, the trees on either side growing denser, their twisted branches leaning toward the car like claws. My knuckles were white on the steering wheel, and every instinct in me screamed to turn around, to abandon this ride. But I couldn't. Something about the man in the back seat felt wrong, as though he would do something terrible if I didn't comply. The silence was broken again by his voice. "Do you believe in the afterlife?" he asked, his tone calm but unnervingly cold. The question caught me off guard. My throat was dry, and I had to clear it before answering. "I don't really think about it much," I lied. He chuckled, a low, guttural sound that made my stomach churn. "You should. It's closer than you think." I didn't respond. I couldn't. My heart was racing, and the chill in the car seemed to seep into my bones. I tried to focus on the road, but the headlights flickered again, plunging us into darkness for just a moment. When the lights came back on, the road seemed different. The pavement looked cracked and uneven, as though it hadn't been maintained in decades. The trees on either side were gnarled and blackened, their branches tangled like dead veins. I was sure I hadn't taken a wrong turn, but the scenery didn't match what I remembered. I glanced in the rearview mirror again, hoping for some reassurance, but what I saw made my blood run cold. The man wasn't sitting anymore. He was crouched on the seat, his face inches away from the back of my headrest. His eyes were wide, unblinking, and pitch black. His grin was even wider now, impossibly so, stretching across his face in a way that no human jaw could manage. "Almost there," he whispered. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely keep the car on the road. I wanted to scream, to pull over and get out, but I felt paralyzed. Something was keeping me in that seat, forcing me to keep driving. The cemetery gates loomed ahead, their iron bars twisted and rusted. They weren't like the gates I remembered from the last time I'd driven past Ridgefield. These were ancient, towering, and seemed to shimmer faintly in the moonlight. As I slowed the car, the man leaned forward, his breath icy on the back of my neck. "Stop here," he said. I obeyed, my trembling foot pressing the brake. "Wait," he added, and his tone left no room for argument. He opened the door and stepped out of the car. For a moment, I thought about speeding away, but when I looked at him through the windshield, something held me back. He stood there, staring at the cemetery gates, and his body seemed to change. His coat billowed as though caught in a strong wind, but the air was still. His limbs elongated, his fingers stretching into claws. His shadow on the pavement moved unnaturally, writhing and twisting like a living thing. He turned back to look at me one last time, his grin now stretching beyond the edges of his face. "You can leave," he said, his voice echoing as though coming from deep within a cavern. For now, I didn't wait for him to say anything else. I slammed on the gas, the tires screeching as I sped away from the cemetery. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. As I drove, the road seemed to shift again, the cracks disappearing, the trees looking normal once more. When I glanced in the rearview mirror, the back seat was empty. I didn't stop driving until I reached my apartment. I stumbled inside, locking every door and window before collapsing onto the couch. My body was trembling, my mind racing. I couldn't explain what had happened, and I wasn't sure I wanted to. The next morning, I checked my rideshare app. The trip wasn't listed in my history. It was as though the ride had never happened. But the smell in my car, wet earth and decaying leaves, lingered for days. And sometimes, when I drive alone at night, I catch glimpses of something in the rearview mirror. A shadow, a grin, a pair of black eyes watching me. I haven't been back to Ridgefield Cemetery since, but I can feel it calling me, whispering in the back of my mind. I know I escaped that night, but for how long? My name is Sarah Henderson, and I am 32 years old. I was born and raised in the bustling city of Chicago, but this story takes place far away from the comforting hum of urban life. About 6 months ago, I decided to leave everything behind and move to a small, secluded town in the Pacific Northwest. The move was not just a change of scenery. It was a desperate attempt to escape the remnants of a toxic relationship that had consumed the last 5 years of my life. I needed solitude, a fresh start, and a place where I could rebuild myself. The house I rented was everything I thought I needed. It sat on the edge of a dense forest, miles away from the nearest neighbor. It was a 2-story cabin with creaky wooden floors, a stone fireplace, and windows that overlooked an expanse of untamed wilderness. It was quiet, isolated, and utterly mine. At least, that's what I told myself at the time. The first few weeks were peaceful. I spent my days unpacking, decorating, and trying to establish a new routine. I even started hiking in the nearby woods, despite a lingering fear of getting lost. The nights, however, were a different story. The silence was oppressive, almost deafening, and I found myself missing the sounds of the city. The creaks and groans of the old house felt alive in the darkness, and though I tried to dismiss them as the natural settling of wood, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was not alone. It started innocently enough. I'd catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye or hear faint rustling sounds outside my window. I chalked it up to wildlife. After all, living so close to the forest meant sharing the space with animals. But then I started noticing something strange. Every night, around the same time, I felt as if someone was watching me. The sensation was so strong that I began closing all the curtains before sunset, hoping to block out whatever or whoever might be outside. One night, I was reading in bed when I felt it again, that unbearable sensation of being observed. I'd drawn the heavy curtains in my bedroom hours earlier, but the feeling was so overwhelming that I couldn't resist peeking out. Slowly, I pulled back the edge of the curtain and froze. There, standing in the shadows just beyond the tree line, was a figure. I couldn't make out any details, but it was unmistakably human-shaped, completely still, and facing my window. My heart raced as I stepped away from the window, my mind scrambling for an explanation. Maybe it was a hunter or a hiker who had wandered too close to my property. But even as I tried to rationalize it, I couldn't ignore the primal fear clawing at my chest. Who would stand motionless in the dark, staring at a stranger's window? I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat in the corner of my bedroom with the lights off, clutching a flashlight and a kitchen knife. When morning came, I mustered the courage to go outside and inspect the area near the tree line. The ground was damp from the previous night's rain, and I found what I was dreading: a single set of footprints leading to the spot where I'd seen the figure. They were large, barefoot, and impossibly deep, as if the person had been unnaturally heavy. What's worse, there were no tracks leading away. I convinced myself that it was an isolated incident, some strange but harmless anomaly. I told myself that the footprints could be explained by the soft ground, that the figure was just a passerby, and that I had nothing to fear. For a while, it seemed like I was right. Days turned into weeks, and nothing unusual happened. The forest remained quiet, the nights uneventful. I began to relax, to believe that whatever I'd seen was a one-time occurrence. Then, one night, I woke up to a soft tapping sound. It was faint but persistent, like fingernails gently rapping against glass. My heart sank as I realized it was coming from the window in my bedroom. I lay frozen in bed, my mind racing. I didn't want to look, didn't want to confirm what I already feared. But the tapping continued, relentless, as if it was daring me to acknowledge it. Summoning every ounce of courage, I turned my head toward the window. The curtains were drawn, but I could see the faint outline of a hand pressed against the glass, fingers splayed wide. The tapping stopped as soon as I looked. I didn't move, didn't breathe. I just stared, waiting for something to happen. After what felt like an eternity, the hand slowly slid down the glass and disappeared. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. When daylight finally broke, I called the local police. 2 officers arrived later that morning and listened patiently as I recounted what had happened. They didn't laugh or dismiss my concerns, but I could tell they were skeptical. They walked around the property, checked the windows, and found no signs of forced entry or evidence of anyone lurking outside. When I mentioned the footprints I'd found weeks earlier, they suggested it was likely a homeless person or a prankster from town. "You're out here all alone," one of the officers said. "It's easy to let your imagination get the better of you, but we'll keep an eye on the area, just in case." Their words didn't comfort me. If anything, they made me feel more vulnerable. I started double-checking every lock, barricading the doors with furniture, and keeping the curtains closed at all times. I even stopped hiking in the woods, too afraid to venture far from the house. But none of it made me feel safe. The final incident happened 3 weeks later. I was in the kitchen, washing dishes, when I felt it again. That oppressive sensation of being watched. This time, it was stronger than ever, an almost physical weight pressing down on me. Slowly, I turned toward the window above the sink. At first, I didn't see anything, just my own pale reflection staring back at me. Then I noticed it. Behind my reflection, in the darkness outside, there were eyes. 2 glowing, amber-colored eyes staring directly at me. I screamed and stumbled backward, knocking over a chair. When I looked again, the eyes were gone, but the fear didn't leave me. It took root, deep and unshakable. I grabbed my car keys and left the house that night, driving to a motel in the nearest town. I never went back. A few weeks later, I broke the lease and hired movers to retrieve my belongings. I didn't care about the deposit or the money I'd spent fixing up the place. All I wanted was to put as much distance as possible between me and that house. To this day, I don't know what I saw. I've tried to convince myself it was a trick of the light, a figment of my imagination, or even a prank. But deep down, I know the truth. Something was out there, watching me, waiting. And whatever it wasn't human.